Last week, the two other members of Benjamin Netanyahu's three-man war cabinet, Benny Gantz and Yoav Gallant, publicly attacked the Israeli Prime Minister for failing to explain how he would end the war in Gaza and what would happen afterwards. A few days later, Gantz issued Netanyahu with an ultimatum, threatening to pull out of the cabinet unless Netanyahu agreed to his six-point plan for post-war Gaza, which includes, amongst other things, the establishment of a, quote, American-European Arab-Palestinian Security Administration in Gaza and a normalization deal with Saudi Arabia. Whilst the ICC warrant has temporarily restored unity, the war cabinet's eventual collapse now looks essentially inevitable. So in this video, we thought we'd explain why Gantz and Gallant are ditching Netanyahu, why this will only empower the far-right ministers in Netanyahu's coalition, and whether Israel might actually be on the brink of civil war. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop when we release new videos. So let's start with a quick recap. Before October the 7th, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu led a coalition government that relied on a couple of far-right Israeli nationalist parties for its narrow majority in Israel's parliament, the Knesset. The two politicians leading this far-right bloc are National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir and the Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who led the Otzma Yehudit and the Religious Zionism parties respectively. Netanyahu had in the past refused to form coalitions with these parties on the grounds that they were apparently too extremist, but he was forced into it after his usual coalition partners refused to govern with him after the November 2022 election, largely because Netanyahu was, and still is, facing a litany of plausible corruption allegations from his previous stints in office. Anyway, this government was immediately unpopular when it came to power, but it only became more so throughout 2023 when it tried to force through a series of controversial reforms to Israel's judicial system. For context, the reforms would have essentially given the Knesset, and therefore the government, more power over the Israeli Supreme Court. Now, to be fair, there's a good faith argument to be made for codifying the relationship between Israel's legislature and judiciary, which is currently ambiguous due to the fact that Israel is one of the few countries in the world without a written constitution. Nonetheless, their detractors argued that the reforms gave too much power to the government, and that Netanyahu was using them to get out of his various legal woes. You get the point. Before October the 7th, Netanyahu's coalition was both unpopular and polarizing. This meant that after the Hamas attacks, it wasn't clear that Netanyahu's government had the political legitimacy to lead Israel during its time of crisis. To steady the ship and limit the influence of the far right, opposition politicians offered to form a national unity government. And Netanyahu couldn't really refuse. So, on October the 11th, a three-member war cabinet was formed, including Netanyahu, Defense Minister and Likud MP Yoav Gallant, and Benny Gantz. Now, for those of you who don't know, Gantz is a former IDF chief and the leader of the National Unity Party. He's the main opposition figure in Israel, and polling suggests he's currently more popular than Netanyahu. However, over the past few months, the war cabinet has slowly fallen apart. Both Gallant and Gantz have clearly become unhappy with Netanyahu's strategy, especially the fact that he's refused to explain how the war in Gaza might end, presumably because he thinks an indefinite war is his best chance at hanging on to power. At the same time, Gantz's continued involvement in Netanyahu's war cabinet has hurt his poll ratings, and the gap between him and Netanyahu has narrowed over the last few months. These dynamics have pushed the cabinet into a sort of doom loop. As Gantz and Gallant's withdrawal from the cabinet has become increasingly likely, Netanyahu has, in anticipation, started buddying up to the far-right ministers that his majority relies on, straining relations further and making the others' withdrawal more likely. Things finally came to a head in the middle of last week, when both Gallant and Gantz publicly demanded that Netanyahu describe a day-after plan for Gaza. Then, on Saturday, Gantz delivered an ultimatum, saying that he would withdraw from the cabinet unless Netanyahu agreed to a post-war plan by June the 8th. Gantz's somewhat optimistic six-point proposal includes returning the hostages, destroying Hamas, the establishment of a, quote, American-European Arab-Palestinian Security Administration to manage Gaza, the return of Israeli residents to their homes by September the 1st, a normalization deal with Saudi Arabia, which we've discussed in a prior video, and the creation of a new national service for all Israelis, including the ultra-Orthodox Haredim. In his speech, Gantz addressed Netanyahu directly, saying the Netanyahu of a decade ago would have done the right thing. Half an hour later, Netanyahu responded by accusing Gantz of tacitly aiding Hamas and demanding he answer three questions. Do you want to go into Rafah? Do you want the Palestinian Authority to eventually take charge of Gaza, which is what the Biden administration apparently wants? And do you want normalization with Saudi Arabia if it means accepting a two-state solution, which is what both the Saudis and the US want? Gantz then responded by saying, "We should have gone into Rafah months ago. I won't accept the Palestinian Authority in Gaza, and I won't agree to a Palestinian state, but I still think we could pursue normalization with the Saudis." This was, to be fair, a pretty clever move by Netanyahu. Given the hawkish mood inside Israel at the moment, it would have been political suicide for Gantz to say anything else, but Gantz's answers will nonetheless strain relations with the Biden administration and dispel any illusions amongst Israel's allies that Gantz would be significantly more dovish or palatable than Netanyahu. So what happens next? Well, it's hard to see the war cabinet escaping its doom loop or Netanyahu agreeing to Gantz's ultimatum, which means it will probably collapse by June the 8th at the latest. Netanyahu will then be entirely reliant on the far right to stay in power, who will probably demand that he escalate further and have ultimately advocated for Gaza to be resettled, i.e. for the Palestinians to be replaced by Jewish immigrants. This will strain relations not just with the US and Israel's other international partners, but also with the majority of Israelis, who don't like or agree with the far right. Unless elections are called or Netanyahu can negotiate a hostage deal, which seems unlikely given Hamas apparently can't guarantee the hostages would be returned alive, we should expect an escalation of the anti-government protests we've seen over the past few months. And some Israeli news outlets and commentators have already been talking up the prospect of civil war. In a sense, this was sort of inevitable. The ideological divide between what we might describe as the Israeli left and the Israeli right has become increasingly wide over time, and whilst the Gaza war might have temporarily provided a source of unity, a reckoning is now long overdue. That's all for this video, but there's a whole world of TLDR content out there. You might not know it, but we actually have 5 different TLDR channels explaining news from the UK, Europe, and rest of the world, breaking down the latest developments in the business world, and also running through the day's most important news that you might have missed. TLDR has been doing this for more than 7 years now, so to celebrate our anniversary, we'd love it if you subscribed. Not only to this channel, but also to any others that interest you, and they're all linked in the description. Our whole purpose is to make the world around you more understandable, to unpack the confusing parts of the news in a way that's interesting, factual, and entirely non-partisan. So if that's something you're into, then you've got 5 channels to enjoy. Thanks for your support over the last 7 years, it really means a lot.